Greetings everybody around the world. It's time once again for Ancient Aliens Radio. This is the dedicated radio show for the cast of Ancient Aliens. Here we interview authors and researchers as an ongoing investigation into the ancient alien theory. Don't forget to like us on Facebook or subscribe to the YouTube channel Ancient Aliens Radio. This is your host James, and I'm delighted to have a returning guest to the show today. We're talking to Mr. Scotty Roberts, and Scotty's background is laced and with varied and diverse skill and experience. He's such an enigmatic guest for the show. 2 years in Christian Bible College, he entered seminary pursuing his Master's in Divinity. And during this time at college and seminary studies, he focused academic and personal passion for history, theatre and art. His religious studies intensified his intense interest in spirituality, and his research of the paranormal expanded throughout the 80s and 90s. Scotty's the founder and publisher of the Intrepid magazine, a journal dedicated to politics, science, extraterrestrial contact, unexplained phenomena, and alternative fringe theories. Of course, Scotty is the author of several books as well. We're going to get into some of these today. The Exodus Reality, The Rise and Fall of the Nephilim, and The Secret History of the Reptilians. So, if they weren't some mammoth titles to talk about, what else would be? So, without further ado, let's bring on today's guests. Hi, Scotty. Welcome to the show.
Hi, James. How you doing?
Oh, great to have you here, Scotty. Great to see you live on the mic, and nice to do the Capricorn TV format too.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
Scotty, from our contact and networking and philosophizing with each other off air and on air, such a prolific researcher, Scotty, you've taken on some pretty big subjects, and I may be big in terms of the alternative, but I think the thing you've done is you haven't dropped your brain out, Scotty. You've kept the core body of, give me some facts, give me some details. Yeah, there's a lot of theological background that we're going into probably, and, but you haven't dropped your brain out, Scotty. I think that's probably what's different with you, the subjects we're going to talk about today.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that. I don't think I've dropped my brain anyway. There are times I wonder. However, this whole thing with the Nephilim, when I started writing it, it really took almost 25 years for that to germinate before it became a reality. And I was in my seminary days back in the early 1980s, and I started questioning these things. And I didn't realize along the number of years just how much had been written out there, especially as we get closer to 2012, which was when the book was actually published. Mm-hmm. And I noticed that there was a lot of information out there as I started researching for the book, because, when you think about all these things and you're writing things down and you collect data, you collect a few books here and there, mm-hmm. and you put a lot of thought process into something. Sometimes it's when you're out driving or down the road in your car and you think about these things, you go, I got to write that down. And that's how things went over the years. And when I started researching it, I realized how much information is out there, how much really silly information is out there as well. What I qualify as silly information is the stuff that it's somebody's idea without anything to back up their idea.
Sure.
And I've grown really weary of this is how I feel, therefore this is what it must be. Oh, I feel that this is the thing, or this is my notion, and so I wanted to avoid that. And where I have written about things that I think are my speculations on something, I clearly state it. I say, this is speculative based on circumstantial evidence or based on my research. And if I fall way outside of that, I say, how about this idea? Here's an idea, but we've got to make sure before we accept any of this that we research it, that we find out, is there something to a notion before it becomes a hypothesis, before it becomes a theory. So that was the approach I took with the Nephilim.
Sure. Now, a lot of people are trying to connect the Nephilim with the giants. Now, I'm all for that. I think the Nephilim of the Bible and the Nephilim giants that are in America with the red hair at the Native American mounds, that's a bit of a reach in some respect to connect all that. However, the Nephilim are referred to as a race of giants. I understand why this is all getting connected. The reason I mentioned that is because so many people are focusing on all this now, Scotty. If the book was in 2012, it's as pertinent today as it was in 2012. And I mean, so many people are talking about this stuff. Let's go to grassroots on the theological aspect first. Let's talk maybe the Nephilim and the Elohim. Give us the definition, what we know from a biblical source first, and that's
All
the
right.
picture that way.
Well, it's interesting that the term Nephilim has really been taken out of, nowadays especially, out of a biblical context. On scant occasions, you'll see somebody make biblical reference. The problem with that is that the word Nephilim is a Hebrew word, and it comes from the Hebrew Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, if you will. And that is the source point of the word. And the word Nephilim is Hebrew that means nephal, means to fall, to come down, to descend, or to leave one's prior estate for another. That kind of thing, a changing of location. And the im on the end, or him in the Hebrew, is a suffix that's placed on the end of the word to denote plurality. So it just simply means those who fell, those who came down, those who left one place and came to another. That's really the Hebrew definition of the word, as you find it, as a bland word in Hebrew.
It might not necessarily, sorry, Scotty, it might not necessarily mean fall from grace.
No, there is no connotation of falling from grace. As a matter of fact, the word nephal in the Hebrew could have meant stumbling and falling down a step. It could have meant falling in battle. It could have meant coming down or flying down or descending something. Could be descending a flight of stairs. You could nephal. But it has that connotation of falling, not necessarily from grace, but perhaps in battle, perhaps having to leave one place for another place. And so there's not a negative connotation with the word.
Okay, so get that out of the way. Tell us about the Elohim then.
The Elohim, there is, in the biblical passage, Genesis 6, it talks about, in the English Bible, it says, and the sons of God came down and intermingled with the daughters of men and had children by them. Well, this term sons of God always confused me. I wanted to know what it meant. In the Hebrew, sons of God is rendered B'nai Ha-Elohim. And Elohim is the name used about 3,000 times in the Old Testament for God. While he has many different names in the Old Testament, Elohim was the one used the most. And Elohim is a word that has the him ending on the end, just like Nephilim. And so the him denotes plurality. Mm-hmm. Elohim literally means God of or among many gods. And that plurality is of El being the base word in the Hebrew for the name of God. So Elohim just simply means God of many gods or God among many gods. And so in essence, what the biblical passage is saying is, those who are of the God of many gods came down and intermingled with the daughters of, and in the Hebrew it says Adam, meaning simply man, human. Mm-hmm. And so there's a difference, a great difference that's being made in the text between the two different beings. Because what I was told, frankly, in seminary, we were told, it doesn't mean anything special about these beings. It just means that the guys who were the sons of the aristocrats who built the school of the prophets came slumming down in the valley with the common women. And I said, but you taught us in systematic theology that words mean things and language is important. So in the Hebrew, if you have the B'nai Ha-Elohim mated with the daughters of Adam, I said, why is the contrast there? Mm-hmm. And I was pretty much told to be quiet about it.
So the Nephilim and the Elohim are related to each other in what respect?
The Elohim and the Nephilim, the Nephilim, as I've clearly stated, are nothing more than the descendants. They're the offspring. You've got the Elohim, and in the book of Enoch, by the way, they're referred to as the Watchers, another very common term that's out there. That's got all this mysticism about it. But the Watchers, or the sons of God, the B'nai Ha-Elohim, came down and mated with women, and the offspring were the Nephilim, those who are of those who fell, or those who came down, or those who left their first estate. It's the Elohim, the plurality.
So whether we're talking angels or extraterrestrials or another Neanderthal type species or whatever it is, we are talking about a hybrid race, an offspring between
definitely
one group and another group.
Now, generally, we define hybrid as being something that cannot then reproduce itself because it's hybrid.
Yeah.
So I think hybrid is probably an incorrect or a misnomer in this case. because it says the Nephilim spread. It said that they grew and spread and filled the whole earth. So there is obviously a reproductive capacity there. So I wouldn't call them strictly hybrid, but they are definitely a hybrid of sorts between what biblically you could look at the text and say, it doesn't say aliens, but they really are talking about extraterrestrials, not of this earth, because they were celestial beings of a sort. At least that's how they were defined by the writers of the scripture. And they're not angels. This is one of the, I believe, also the big misnomers about the Watchers and the Elohim, the sons of God. It never calls them angels anywhere. In the language being used there, angelos, or in the Greek, angelos, would have been angel or messenger. And angelos never appears in the Hebrew text anywhere. Mm-hmm. It's not used to describe these beings. What is used is Elohim. And it's interesting, if you do a little cross-referencing for the sake of scriptural cross-referencing, go to Psalm 82, and there's a very clear-cut passage. It doesn't tell what's going on, but we know that God is judging someone here, and he's in front of a group known as the Divine Council in the English. And it reads like this, and Elohim, or God, it says in the English text, and Elohim stood before the Elohim. And he said to them, you are all Elohim, the bright shining princes of heaven. But then he goes on to pass judgment on them for something that's unmentioned. And the interesting part is where you see the word Elohim used as both singular and plural. It's got the plural suffix on it, but it stands for God. You ask a rabbi or rabbinic school, they'll say Elohim can mean multiplicity of gods. It can also mean a singular God with a multiplicity of power and majesty. And I believe that is something that's added to the word. It's an interpretation, not what the word actually says. So what you've got in Psalm 82, Elohim, singular, stood before the Elohim, plural, a group. And he, singular, said to them, plural, you are all Elohim, plural, the bright shining princes of heaven.
Highly indicative of something, Scotty.
I think it is. To me, and this would be blasphemous or heretical in some circles. For sure. But I believe the Old Testament actually does not teach monotheism. It teaches that there is more than one God, if you will. There was Elohim, there was Jehovah. There was also the Elohim by definition, meaning there are more than one. And there was the Elohim singular addressing a group he referred to as Elohim by the same name in the plurality. And so I think what you've got there is a case of something that is very much like the Greek gods of Olympus, the Roman gods, this pantheon of gods that is there. And as a matter of fact, in several places in the Old Testament, especially you'll see it in the Garden of Eden story, which, by the way, links the princes, the bright shining princes of heaven, to the bright shining one, Nakash, the serpent character of the Garden of Eden story, which is in the text. He's never called Satan, the devil, or Lucifer. He's referred to as Nakash, which means bringer of knowledge, the bright shining one, the bringer of chaos, and not in that negative sense, just chaos, meaning it's upturning things from what they once were to what they are now. And you have a response to his actions in the Genesis story, which says, and Elohim said, the humans have eaten of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and have become just like us. Let us therefore go and prevent them from also eating of the tree of life, lest they become immortal. And this is what's interesting about those words, is you see them referred to and cross-referenced back to older stories.
In a biological sense, these guys, okay, forget a bit too much, but if there was a biological offspring, sex with women from a hybrid race, if we want to just use the generic to hybrid in its wrong context, I understand that. But if there was a biological offspring, it might explain why there was giants, why there was a gigantic aspect.
Well, I think one of the things that was really discovered more recently, I don't have a date for this, and I think within the last several decades, is that the giant interpretation in Genesis 6 isn't referring to giants. It's a mistranslation. It's talking about the Elohim, and it's talking about the Nephilim. But they had mistranslated Nephilim to mean giant, when it doesn't mean giant at all. And I gave the definition for you a little earlier about those who came down or those who left one place and came to another. But they do, however, refer to, when they're talking about later in that passage in Genesis 6, 1-4, it talks about, and these were the heroes of old, the men of renown. It refers to the Nephilim. And it talks about what it's referring to, making reference to there is the Hebrew Gibborim. The Gibborim, and Gibborim, if you cross-reference them in other literature, in Hebrew literature, they were giants. And they were these giant beings that could be, think of the Fae and the fairy folk, who could be, in one hand, very pleasant to you, and on the other hand, could be as terrifying and demonic, so to speak, as you could see. And this is what the Gibborim were like. They were the mighty warriors, the men of old, the men of renown, in Jewish literature. And those were giants.
Wow.
But they're never mentioned by name in the passage.
The word Rephaim then, R-E-P-H-A-I-M, Rephaim, where does that fit in? Is that just another name for?
That's just another name that's used later in the Hebrew writings, later in the Old Testament. It speaks of the Rephaim. It speaks of, you remember the story of David and Goliath.
Yeah.
And Goliath being this great giant who, according to the passage, measured 6 cubits in a span. And a cubit was roughly your elbow to the tip of your finger. But of course, that all depended on who was doing the measuring. Oh, if you're 5'8" and you measure, or you're 6'2" and you measure, you're going to get a different cubit. And also he was dressed in Philistine armor with the tall feathers, the tall helm. And if you take the average measurement of a cubit, he was roughly 9'4", something like that. And we've got basketball players today that are pushing that. In the Chinese player, I can't think of him, but he's pushing that height. So he's not quite 9 feet, but he's tall. And there's also, regarding Goliath, by the way, I should mention this. They talked about when David slung the stone at him and said it sank into his forehead. And they're saying, this is evidence of perhaps giantitis or giantess, where, he had soft, brittle bones and the stone would sink into his head. And I said, well, there are guys who are pretty crafty even today with that kind of a sling, and you could sink a stone into somebody's head pretty easily, and they don't have to have giantess or some kind of bone malfunction. And by the way, the biblical passage talks about Goliath being a warrior, and a warrior from the days of his youth. And if he was somebody who was infirmed and couldn't walk right and had brittle bones, I don't think many people would have been afraid to fight him. But it does refer to him and his 3 brothers of Gath as sons of the Nephilim. So it's very interesting. Now, there's a correspondence made between the Nephilim and a giant of Gath. So and there are other passages in the Old Testament talking of the Rephaim, the Nephilim, and so on. But interesting story is, all we know is that David, we have the cute little Sunday school story where the little kid with the sling, conquers the giant. It's become a metaphor down through the ages. What we forget is the story itself. That David was probably in his late teens, if not his early 20s by then. He was just the youngest son of Jesse, and he's tending the sheep, and he went into battle with this guy. And it said after he hit him with the stone, it said he took Goliath's sword, smote his head from his body, and he took Goliath's head and sword with him to Jerusalem. Now, the interesting point there, historically or textually, is that David did not become the king and go to Jerusalem for about another 13 years. So there's an extrapolated piece of history there about David and Goliath being written much later. And so David had that head and sword with him for 13 years at least before he entered Jerusalem. And then it says, during that time, he and his mighty men of valor hunted down the other 3 brothers of Goliath and slew them all. So there's some parts of that story that don't get commonly told.
Scotty, I'm sitting here thinking, and as an engineer, I've done statistics and mathematics. I've had to a high level. And one part we functioned on statistics was population statistics, and all populations, whether they're rabbits or bears, whatever, they breed and they settle down, and you can write a population statistics for any type of breeding program.
Sure.
However, if there were giants as offspring, eventually that would settle down. Perhaps in that statistical, measurable sense, there was some giants as offspring initially. However, that would have just been absorbed into the population.
I think so. Absorbed, bred down, and it's interesting that the references made to them in the Old Testament after the flood story, which is supposedly where they were all wiped out, the reference there speaks of almost remnants of them. And what's very interesting when you talk about the flood story, I believe, and again, now we're looking at less the technical side of who the Nephilim are, and I'm looking mostly from the biblical stories. I believe the first of the Nephilim was Cain, the son of Adam and Eve, and I established this pretty solidly in the Nephilim book, and it says that Nakash, the serpent character in the garden, who I believe it's very clear was one of the Elohim mentioned in Psalm 82, that Nakash mated with Eve, and that Eve took this gift or this forbidden fruit, if you will, which I think is metaphor in the Garden of Eden story, and brings it to Adam. And they also mate, and she has twin sons. If you look at creation myths throughout the world, the original that have original families in them, they generally also have attached to them multiple births. And so Eve, I think, consistent with other creation myths, had multiple birth. She had Cain and Abel, but it's very clear by the things that are written in the Genesis account. And when I say very clear, it's very clear when you look for it. I believe she had multiples, and that Cain was the son of Nakash and Eve, and Abel was the son of Adam and Eve. And this bears itself out in the chronologies, because if you go down through the chronologies between Adam and Noah, then Noah and Abraham and David, and then in the New Testament, from Jesus and his mother back to King David to establish that he was of the lineage of David, the king. When you look at all these lineages in the Old Testament, it links them all together all the way back to Adam, but they skip Cain, the firstborn. Why do they do that? When every other line throughout the chronology uses the firstborn son of each family to link the lineage. They skip Cain because Cain was not of the pure human blood. He was of the blood of the mix of Nakash and Eve, and therefore was overlooked as the firstborn human, from which the line of the Messiah, the messianic prophecies, which all began in the Garden of Eden. If you read the text, the prophecy of a Messiah, a kinsman redeemer, as he was known in the Old Testament Hebrew sense, this kinsman had to be of the pure human bloodline of Adam, not of Nakash. And so they don't trace the lineage back all the way to Adam through Cain. They trace it through their third-born son, Seth, because Cain murdered his brother Abel. Eve and Adam have a third son, name him Seth. And so the line of Seth is the human line that bequeaths the line all the way to Noah, that bequeaths supposedly all the other races of the earth. I've been criticized from some people who don't really read exactly what I wrote there, that there is a thing called the Christian identity theology, which was founded in the early 1920s. And this is a white supremacist group. It's a Christian group that wants to claim that Cain was the father of the Jews, and they go through all this racist stuff, and it leads up to white supremacy for sake of simplicity. I don't adhere to that whatsoever. Cain, according to the biblical account, his line was the line of Nephilim, and that would have filled the earth, but it was wiped out at the flood, according to the passage. Now, this is why God brought the judgment flood of Noah, not because of the wickedness of mankind, but because of the wickedness brought to mankind in all of this interbreeding. So this is the religious mythology as it stands in there. The flood was supposed to have wiped them all out, but if you look at the passage, before the flood story starts, it talks of the Nephilim. It says, and the Nephilim, it says the Elohim, the sons of God, came down, intermingled with the daughters of men, had children by them. They were on the earth in those days, The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, it says. And so that's what's interesting, is this is supposed to be a judgment to wipe them out, but it's ineffectual, because there's still a remnant of them that's out there. Mm-hmm. And this is where you see the remnants of the Nephilim, of the Rephaim, of these beings that are out there, such as Goliath, who you find much later in the Old Testament.
Sure. I'm not the greatest biblical scholar, Scotty, but I have come to believe from meeting guys like yourself and talking and philosophizing that I now consider the biblical sources to be a historical account, at least in the sense that we may not understand them totally, but I do think there's a historical core body of truth in them all.
I do too. I do too. And I think this is where people who want to... I always think there is a bias when people say, "Oh, you can't go by that. That's in the Bible. The Bible, as we know, is all storybook." Well, that in and of itself is an incredibly naive statement about the Bible. The Bible is a book rife with historical accounts, and that history just happens to be the faith stories wrapped around them. This does not make the historical account ineffectual. It just means that the faith part of the story is something that you can either choose to believe that or not choose to believe that. But there are faith stories wrapped around these historical accounts, and they're finding more and more and more and more, especially with critical biblical archaeology, for lack of a better term, that's out there. There are archaeologists that sometimes are solely in the field because they are drawn to wanting to find out if a biblical story that they were raised on in their faith has any efficacy to it.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned biblical archaeology, because even if one case of biblical archaeology proves the Bible to be true, that's enough. But I think... Well,
absolutely. I always like to use a prime example for me is, for hundreds of years, it was said that Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea in the first century, that presided over the trial of Jesus of Nazareth, it was always said that he was a part of the Jesus mythos. He was just a fictional character because there was no evidence in Roman history that he ever existed. Other than you had the writings of Tacitus that mention him. You've got the writings of Josephus, the highly dubious writings of Josephus from the first century that speak of Pontius Pilate. But there were no real Roman records that existed of him, so they passed him off as part of the Jesus myth. And it wasn't until 1964 they were excavating in Caesarea Philippi, which was the Roman capital on the Mediterranean in Israel, for the Roman governorship there. And they were excavating something else, and they ran across a cornerstone of a gymnasium that had been built in the first century. And the gymnasium cornerstone read Praefectus Pontius Pilatus, dedicating this the Tiberium or something like that to Tiberius Caesar. Wow. And so that was one of the first solid bits of archaeological evidence that Pontius Pilate actually existed and was actually a prefect of Judea in the first century during the time that Jesus was supposed to have lived. And so when you start finding facts like that, and it counter affects the notion that he was just a notion himself, that's where you start to say, okay, once you start proving the historical account is there, what does that do to the rest of these historical accounts in the Bible? So I think they've said there's been almost every historical account has been so researched and has had archaeologists digging on it that there's hardly any historical account left in the pages of the Old Testament that has not been at least proven to be almost absolutely congruent with the scriptural account, and there's only just a handful that have not, as far as I know, and there's still question marks over them.
Yeah, and that was a pertinent thing I wanted to make too, Scotty. And this is the thing for me, and what we just discussed with the biblical archaeology. I need something like that. I'm one of those type of guys. I'm not a theology guy, but when I see the tangible aspect to this now, I go, oh, I'm going to wake up to other things in the biblical resources, at least for the research purposes. I think a great example, and go back to the Nephilim and the giants thing, is Og, the king of Bashan. Yes. In the Bible, they're describing his bed, and his bed is extremely big, Scotty, for a giant.
Now, here's an interesting point on that, is they describe this huge bed. that it would have had to have fit a man who was like 9 feet tall or something like that. Mm-hmm. And my first reaction to that would be, now, it either meant a 9-foot man slept in it, or you had a guy that liked a really big bed. He might have been 4'8" and just said, I want a parade ground for me and my harem. And, you don't know that for sure. I think the reason, though, that the bed is in there and telling the measurement is it's there for a purpose in the passage. Mm-hmm. It's not just to say, this was a short guy who liked a really big bed. It doesn't say that. I think the implication in the text, it's there for a reason to say, this was a big dude.
Yeah.
And he had a big bed. And I think this might be a good place to say, too, is that while I talk a lot about the scripture, this is where I studied, and I was once very steeped in the faith, and I have drifted far afield from the faith. I am somebody who I'm not an atheist, but I am a pure agnostic, just meaning simply I don't know the answers anymore to the faith questions.
Sure.
And I'm still seeking those. So I don't adhere to the faith story in case anybody listening or watching might say, well, this guy's just a Christian. He's just trying to justify his faith. I'm not. I don't have an axe to grind either way. As a matter of fact, I would tend to go with a lot of ideas that go against what the scriptural teaching of faith might say. But the historical accounts where you can find that they're documented or verifiable, that to me says something is to that story, which makes it a really interesting story. And so you have to ask, is the faith question that's wrapped around it, is there anything to that? Because all of a sudden, we find the historical story is accurate. So it's all a part of a searching process for me.
I had L.A. Marzulli on. I know you know L.A. and
I know him. Yes.
Interesting guy, and he concentrates a lot on the Nephilim architecture and goes at that angle. It is a point worth noting, and I know you're coming to the British Isles for a tour as well, Scotty.
Yes, with you.
Coming to my neck of the woods to look at some ancient megalithic Nephilim architecture. I've come to believe it is Nephilim architecture for a variety of reasons. We could do another show on that. However, there are many place names in Europe, specifically the British Isle, that have the name Og in it. And they are megalithic. They are megalithic cyclopean structures just rife across Britain. We even have an Irish tale.
First time I thought about that with the name Og, if you remember the old John Wayne movie, The Quiet Man, filmed in Ireland. And the old man in there was Micheline Og Flynn. And that's when I first heard that name, I thought, I wonder if there's any connection to that.
Yeah.
So
we even have, in the Gaelic tales, we even have an old tale, a mythological tale of Tir and Og. Tir means land.
Yes.
And Og means the land of Og.
Yes.
People think that's the land of young because Og means young now. But these giants were supposed to have longevity. That's maybe why Og now means young in Irish, to live forever, in other words, to be immortal. So they may,
I didn't know that
may refer to the name Og as the immortal ones because it's got such longevity. Let's go back to Noah, the book of Enoch. I mean, all these biblical people living such long periods of time, they would consider them immortal to a normal being of 70 years old.
Yes. And, I think also of the Tuatha De Danann, which I am not well schooled fully on the Tuatha, but, I found it very interesting that the Tuatha De Danann are a counterpart or a correlated myth that looks just like the biblical Nephilim myth.
Oh, sure.
It speaks of the bright, shining gods who descended from the heavens, intermingled, and there were the great wars and so on, and they were driven back into the hollow hills and became known as the elven folk. And this elven folk, again, there's the word El appearing there from the Elohim. And so you've got the elven folk, and these were characters that were supposed to be immortal. They were supposed to, by immortal, I mean they could live much longer. They could get hit by a chariot and probably die, but they were supposed to have long natural lives. Wow. And they were driven back, and they were descended from heaven. And of course, you get the historical versions of who they were, but I think the historical versions and the mythical versions kind of clash with each other a bit. obviously, but these characters, the Tuatha, are a correlation to the Nephilim, and probably one and the same.
Yeah, we've got incredibly early sources for the Tuatha De Dan, or Tua De Dan. I pronounce it the English way. I should pronounce it the Irish way, is Tua De Dan. I pronounce it like I say it in English, but incredibly fascinating people, a group of people. Incredibly, a lot of parallels too, Scotty. You're right. There is a lot of parallels there. I want to kind of migrate into the Anunnaki, Scotty, because maybe the Amorites are in the Bible. Maybe the crossover we could talk about. The Amorites are linked with the Sumerians, but they're also in the Bible, and they were supposed to be of giant stature as well. Is these Amorites, are these just another label or another name for these same group of people migrating into Sumeria?
It's possible, because it's one of those people groups that we don't know much about. And I do want to make a connection before we get into that, is as far as the Tua, or the Tuatha De Danann. There was also that Danann. It was said to have been descended from the goddess Danu, but it's also a correlation to the word Anu, which is the Anu, the Anunnaki, and they're actually referred as the Anu even in the old cuneiform text from Mesopotamia.
While you're
so
there,
it's possible the Tuatha were the Tuatha De Anu, and so the correlations are very strong there.
Actually, and further to that, in the Book of Invasions and the Book of Leinster, where they mention these tales of the Tua De Danann, or some people actually call it the tribe of Danu in English, but there was another tale of Shitante, who was apparently conceived like an immaculate conception, no father, but his father was the sky god Anu. So there's another reference there to the sky god Anu. And that's, Shitante is a famous, mythological figure, or a hero of at least of the Celtic tales anyway.
Again, what's very interesting to me is how much information is borrowed from culture to culture to culture. Mm-hmm. This is where you start looking into historical study, anthropological study. I always like to look at the similarities between the Genesis story and the Anunnaki story. Mm. And what I have written about this, I've said it appears to me that Moses, if Moses is who the Bible says he was, and I believe I believe I've identified who Moses was. He had pharaonic training as a palace brat, if you will. Mm-hmm. He was raised in the palace. He became, I believe he was a man named Senenmut, who became the Grand Vizier of Egypt beneath the Pharaoh Hatshepsut. And he would have had 92 royal titles given to him at the time. And if this is the man that indeed is Moses, or became Moses, and the Exodus took place under him 40 years after this time period, this is a man who would have brought with him all this education of the spirituality of Egypt, the religion, military training, pharaonic training, civic training, all of this stuff he brought with him. But if he was then for 40 years down in the Sudan, then over into the Sinai Peninsula, and he would have learned this in Egypt as well, the Sinaitic religions, the Mesopotamian religions, the Canaanite religions. And when you look at what Moses is said to have penned in the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, you're seeing, just look at the Genesis story of the Garden of Eden alone, and the similarities to the Anunnaki story of creation are staggering. You have, in the Anunnaki story, you have Enlil, who is also known as Elil, mm-hmm. and you've got him conscripting his brother god, or lesser god, if you will, Enki, mm-hmm. also known as Ea, and he has Enki create, as it says in the cuneiform text, create primeval man, that we may use him to dig our trenches, our canals, mine our natural resources, to till our gardens, and so on. And so Enki and Elil later, about almost 1,500 to 2,000 years later, with the movement of man from the Fertile Crescent area down into the Canaanite region, they established their religions. Canaanite religion has Elil becomes El, the name for God. Enki, known as Ea, becomes the same base word as Yahweh, which is Jehovah.
Wow.
And this is 1,500, 2,000 years later. Also in the Anunnaki story, it says that after mankind is created, they're doing all this work for the gods, and that the king Atrahasis, you look at the tale of Atrahasis in the cuneiform texts, mm-hmm. and it's where he pleads to his god Enki, the god of his city, his patron god, Enki of Eridu, his city. And he prays to him and he says, "Oh, Enki, hear the words of your servant Atrahasis." And look at how biblical it sounds already. "And bend your ear to your servant and deliver us from this yoke of bondage that we have to the gods, to the Anu." And it says, "And Enki heard his words and blessed him and came down with his mighty men of valor, taught him the forbidden knowledge of the gods, helped the humans rebel against God, and the humans won their freedom under Atrahasis. But Enki and his mighty men, or his mighty god followers, they were conscripted by Elil, the chief god, to the subterranean caverns of the earth to dwell in judgment forever, because they helped the humans rebel." Now, and Enki, by the way, also dwelt in the great Abzu, the underground sea, and he would come up in his boat, and he would ride in what was known as the Serpent's Marsh, which was around the backwaters of the Euphrates River around the city of Eridu, is where they said this was. And it was filled with serpents, of course, but he thought it was a beautiful place, and he loved going there, Enki, the god. And so the backwaters around the city of Eridu, of the Euphrates, became known as the Serpent's Den, and then they put his name to it. Enki, Ea, became known as Ea's Den, which was then eventually became known as Ea-Den or Eden.
Wow.
Now, take all of that information and go to the biblical story of Genesis. You have El coming from Elil. You have Jehovah coming from Ea, or Yahweh, Ea, Enki. You have a story where mankind is created and placed in the garden to till the ground and keep it for us, as God said to them. And in the Annunaki story, the humans were there to till the ground and produce natural resources and mine them and dig canals. In the Genesis story, it's just watered down to tilling the ground and keeping it for us. You also then have the serpent character, Nakash, the bright shining one, came down, who his name by definition means bringer of knowledge, bringer of information, the bright shining one, the trickster, the bringer of chaos, and he delivers the word to the humans of how they are to become just like the gods, or to rebel against the gods. And then, of course, the Genesis story has the fall of man. And then what happens? The serpent is condemned by God. On his belly he shall go, and he becomes later, 1,000 years later, Satan, the devil, Lucifer, is attributed to him by later writers, never called that in the text. And hell was a place in the subterranean caverns of the earth and so you see the similarities between the Anunnaki story and the Genesis story. So I believe Moses, who penned this traditionally, and I believe there's no reason to doubt it, just because he's this famous patriarch of the faith of Judaism and Christianity, doesn't mean he wasn't a real guy. I think there's too much evidence for it. And as I said, I think I know who he was in Egyptian history. But he wrote this stuff, and he brought all this information from these different cultures as the foundation for what he wrote in the book of Genesis.
Sure. Wow, Scotty, what an awesome discussion. Just for the viewers and the listeners, if you're going to read anything on the Anunnaki, get your hands on the Atrahasis account, the Enuma Elish, and the Epic of Gilgamesh, because these are the three monster accounts that reveal so much about what we're talking about here. Just to concentrate on the Epic of Gilgamesh, which really is a recount of the flood myth, or the flood story. Even Gilgamesh was supposed to be a giant as well. I mean, the parallels between the biblical sources, between the Anunnaki Sumerian tales and the tales of everything is just intertwined, Scotty, for me. It's just the parallels just keep going.
If you want to read, I've always said to people, if you want to get a good book to sit down and read with your partner or your significant other, get the English translations of the cuneiform texts of the Sumerians and Mesopotamia and the stories of the Anunnaki. It reads like War and Peace kind of, and it's or a great action film. Yeah. And also is the Book of Enoch. Now, this is a book that was booted out of the canon of Old Testament scripture. by the councils that began with the Council of Nicaea and spread into other councils, where they determined over a number of years what were the books that were to be included in Scripture out of all these books they had. And under the council that started with Constantine, the emperor, the Roman emperor, the pagan Christian emperor of Rome. And they ended up booting the Book of Enoch out because the edict was really, we cannot allow a book in Scripture unless there is unanimous agreement between all the bishops making the decision. And on the books that they couldn't agree on, they either kicked them out completely, or if there was so much disagreement that they didn't really know what to do with it, they put them in the apocryphal books, which kind of set aside books. And Enoch is one of those. And you take that passage in Genesis, the Genesis 6:1-4, that talks about the Nephilim and the sons of God, the Elohim, and so on. You go to Enoch and it spreads those 4 verses into 11 chapters. And this is where I believe Moses, who penned the book of Genesis, borrowed information or was referencing information or plagiarizing maybe information from the book of Enoch, which only dates to the 400s BC, but it's supposedly supposed to have been a copy of a much older book that Berosus was looking at in the 4th century BC. And this was a much older text. And so the book of Enoch supposedly dates back much further. And the 4th century is about 1,000 years after Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. So you can start to see how the dating of all this works. But the book of Enoch has some very interesting information. It talks about these 200 prefects who descended from heaven on the slopes of Mount Armon, which is Mount Hermon in the north of Israel. It straddles the borderland between Israel and Lebanon. And it says they touched foot there, and they decided to go in amongst human women and mate with them. And then, of course, the whole story takes off from there. But the very interesting point is that it never calls them angels in the book of Enoch. It says that they are the Elohim. It says they are the sons of the Watchers. The Watchers who came down, which is correlated in the Genesis account with the sons of God. So it's a very interesting account. If you want to really read some Book of Enoch is like the book of Genesis on crack. So.
For sure. It's funny, I was with Andrew Collins doing a TV interview as well. I was in London, and when we were there, we were having a chat afterwards. He had a copy of the Book of Enoch. He said it's his most prized possession. It was 1789 copy.
Oh, wow.
It was actually Masonic Order, or fellow Brothers of Light, that produced this wonderful thing. And that just made me think that, why it hasn't been in the public eye for the last 200 years, but maybe some orders have traditionally,
it's obscure because it's an apocryphal book.
Yeah.
So, but you get your researchers who want to know what these things are about on a deeper level. And when people say, especially from a theological point of view, will say, well, you can't really use that book because it's an apocryphal book. Well, to that, I just say, well, that's perhaps for those who are adherents to your theology. To us who research, it's another book. It's another ancient book that tells about these things.
The Dead Sea Scrolls, I believe, have somewhat verified the Book of Enoch, the apocryphal.
They have. That's what's
incredible.
Very interesting too is that you look at all the people in the Bible that quoted from the Book of Enoch. So if the Book of Enoch was only from the 4th century BC, you did have some of the minor prophets quoted from the Book of Enoch in the Old Testament. You had the Apostle Paul quoted from the Book of Enoch. You had Jesus himself quoted from the Book of Enoch. And so when you've got these luminaries of the faith in the Bible that quote from the book, there's something, I think, to the book. Why should the book then have been discarded if they quoted from the book as a source point?
It was X-rated, Scotty. It was X-rated.
Yeah, that's for sure. And, X-rated, you got the Song of Solomon.
Probably explains why they couldn't push that book out of existence totally. That's why it made it, because there were so many references to the book. They said, well, we got to keep the book, but we'll push the book.
That's it. That's why they put it into the collection of apocryphal books, because they couldn't discard it. Now, what's interesting is all the stuff that's coming up that was discarded. A lot of the Gospels. There were something like 60 different Gospels that were written, and we've only got 4 of them in the New Testament. But those 4, if you step back from them, each tend to represent a different train of messianic thought or a sect of messianic thought from the New Testament era in first century Judea. And you've got like your Herodian messianic sect. You've got your Jewish messianic sect or Hebrew, and there were 4 different ones. And so it's very interesting that those gospels represent those different ways of thinking.
Mm-hmm. Scotty, I know I focused a lot on the Nephilim today. I just want you to give us out the title of your Exodus Reality book.
Sure.
Give us the website for that as well, and tell us about the symposium that you're running this year, and obviously the tour in Ireland.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, we've got a bunch of stuff going on all the time. The book is called The Exodus Reality, and it's subtitled Unearthing the Real Historical Moses, Identifying the Pharaohs and Examining the Exodus from Egypt. I co-authored this book with my good friend, Dr. John Ward. Mm-hmm. He is an English or British archaeologist working in Luxor, Egypt for the last 15 years on the site of Gebel El Silsila. And he and I had different views on who Moses was. And we wrote this book with 2 opposing viewpoints, and we go back and forth through the book. But we took a trip over there, and we did he obviously lives there. We went to a lot of different sites connected with the stories, out to the Sinai, to what we believed is the actual mountain of God mentioned in the scripture, Serebet el-Khadnim. And so we wrote about this, and the book it's a beautiful book. It's got 70 black and white pictures, and I think 16 pages of full color pictures in the book. And we present our 2 different theories. And while we differ, we're really only 2 generations apart in the same royal house in the 18th dynasty that we're separated by. And John takes a less biblical view. His is more of an archetypical view. And mine is more of there are solid dates in the history in the Bible that you can follow to establish that match up to the dates of the chronology of the Egyptian kings and history as we know it that's out there.
I lean towards your version in the book. Don't tell John, though.
I won't tell him. I promise. My lips are sealed. We also do the Paradigm Symposium, and that is every October in Minneapolis, Minnesota. We have a symposium. This will be our 4th year this year, the Paradigm Symposium 2015. And you can go to paradigmsymposium.com and see some of the speakers that we have on. We have Randall Carlson from Sacred Geometry, and he's going to be speaking. We've got a whole line of speakers that I won't even attempt to go through off the top of my head, but we've had speakers in the past like Graham Hancock, Robert Schock, ufological speakers, ancient alien speakers. We've had Eric von Daniken here and other people like that. And so it's going to be a fantastic symposium, October 1st through the 4th, 2015, Minneapolis, at the Crowne Plaza Mall of America. So it's 5 minutes from the airport, the international airport, and 5 minutes from the Mall of America.
Incredibly successful symposium you do run there, Scotty. Great speakers, great network of
and
people.
You're going to be speaking this year as well.
I am indeed, Scotty. You're making me come to America.
Yes, we are. So you get to experience our autumn here.
But in return, I'm making you come to Ireland as well. So please let people know about the Irish tour. We got quite a lineup of speakers and researchers on the tour.
There is a fantastic tour of Ireland that we're doing. It's with John Ward, and I run the Exodus Reality Adventures, where we take trips to Egypt and bring people over with us. And he, of course, lives there. But we have teamed up with Micah Hanks of the Graylian Report, with you, and with Barry Fitzgerald. People know him formerly of Ghost Hunters International. That's the quick reference to bring up a name in the mental visual. And he's an author of many books, and he's a great researcher on Ireland's past and on a lot of these mysterious things that take place. And so we've got John, Micah, Barry, you, and me are all leading this tour of Ireland. And it's Ireland's, we're calling it the megalithic, I don't have it in front of me, so it's megalithic and sacred places tour of Ireland. It takes place June of this year, so the middle of the year and the middle of the month, the 12th through the 23rd of June. We're all going to be in Ireland. We have spaces for 15 people, And so get your tickets quick because these are going to go fast. We've just started putting it out there the last couple of days. And you can help with this too, James. Some of the places we're going to be seeing are the megalithic sites, the ancient megalithic sites, but also the sacred places, as the Irish refer to the thin places. And we're going to see some things that are way off the beaten path. So, as well as drink some Guinness. So if you want to join us, go to ExodusReality.com. That's the website that John and I have for the travel that we do. So ExodusReality, just like the book title, .com, and click on the Ireland link. You can't miss it. It's right near the top under the header. And if you scroll down a bit, you'll see a big colorful banner for the Irish trip. You can click on all that and you can find tickets and ways to get to be part of this trip.
Sure. Of course, I have you linked up on jameswagger.com for tours, events, and you'll see it on the homepage as well, jameswagger.com. You'll find it that way too. Scotty, it's been fascinating talking to you today. I could talk about the Nephilim and the Annunaki all day long. The more I look into this stuff, Scotty, the more research I do, the more I find it really intellectually satisfying that we have some interesting, fascinating origins. But we have, I mean, if we didn't have these ancient resources to dwell upon, I mean, we wouldn't have a clue, Scotty. I mean, we really
That's
wouldn't.
Right. And I think that is that's the fascination about it, is there is material out there.
Tantalizing.
It's not just an idea that somebody thunk up and had this, had a great dream and made up a great story. There's so much correlating information that crosses cultures that you can't deny that it's there. Now, the hard work is making it all pieced together.
Tantalizing scraps of evidence from a multitude of sources. Scotty, I thank you for your time today. Of course, don't forget, Scotty does the Intrepid Paradigm radio program with Dr. John Ward. Check that out there. Scotty, I really thank you for your time today. It's been a fascinating discussion as always.
Thank you, James.